Welcome everyone, good evening, and welcome to the Discussions with the Dean. I'm Dr. Pete Gathje, Vice President of Academic Affairs, Academic Dean here at Memphis Theological Seminary. And about once a month, I am trying to visit with an author to discuss their most recent book. And tonight I'm honored to welcome Dr. Carmichael Crutchfield to a conversation about his new book, The Formation of a People, Christian Education and the African-American Church. So let me briefly introduce Dr. Crutchfield, and then we'll jump right in with some questions and encourage those who are participating in the webinar to also submit questions via the chat. And we'll try to get to your questions as well, or the Q&A feature of Zoom. So Dr. Carmichael Crutchfield holds the Clara Scott Chair of Church and Ministry at Memphis Theological Seminary, where he also serves as Professor of Christian Education, Spiritual Formation, and Youth Ministry. He's also the General Secretary of the Department of Christian Education of the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. Dr. Crutchfield is a prolific author of materials and speaker in the area of Christian education. He's written and published numerous curricula, including the first published Vacation Bible School material for the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. That's in addition to book chapters, book reviews, and scholarly presentations at the Religious Education Association and other professional meetings. He's actually given hundreds of talks, ecclesial presentations, workshops, seminars across the United States and beyond. Dr. Crutchfield is a fully ordained and fully connectional clergy person in the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. He's also served as a full-time pastor and a supply pastor. He sees himself as a spiritual intellectual, a term he first heard from Dr. James Cone. His work in the church and the academy are closely related, and he's a board member of the Religious Education Association, Payne College, and Lane College. He's a lifetime member of the NAACP and the Omega Psi Phi fraternity. So welcome, Dr. Crutchfield.
Thank you, Dr. Gathje.
It's good to have you here tonight. I'd like to jump right in and ask you a question about why you decided to write this book. What motivated you to do the research and the writing of your new book?
I tell you, it seems like a long time ago now, a friend of mine who we are actually in the process of writing a book, we proposed a book to Judson Press concerning youth ministry in the African-American Church. And Judson approved of that proposal, but then came to me very quickly and said they wanted us to put that book on the back burner. And what they really needed was a book, if I would be interested, they asked, in working on a book such as this, that emphasized Christian education in the African-American Church. So their last publications of this book were very old and very dated, and they needed something fresh and wanted to know if I was interested. And I was very interested in doing that, having taught classes at the seminary in African-American Christian education, and had basically seen the majority of the material on the subject. And I felt there was a void in that research and that work that had been done, and there was room for me to add to the scholarship. So, and I jumped at that and very gladly was able to do that. Although once I got into it, I knew it was a bigger job than I thought it was going to be.
It always is. I'm really intrigued by the title of the book because it brings together formation and brings together formation in the Christian life and Christian education. So could you speak about how you connect those two things, formation and education, in the writing of this book, or in the argument of the book?
Okay. It really starts with the story of MTS. I was fortunate enough, never really planned to do so, but did a D-Min at Memphis Theological Seminary between 99 and 2002. And my project paper and the work that I did was a model of Christian education based on spiritual formation and discipleship. From that time, after that time in 2002, I was elected to the position that you mentioned earlier as General Secretary, Christian Education. And all of the curriculum basically that I've developed has been around that model of Christian education in some way or another. So formation, I first heard the word at Memphis Theological Seminary, first moved into it and understood more about what it meant then. And so for me, formation of a people is forming people in the likeness of Jesus Christ. And that likeness of Jesus Christ is loving God with everything, as the scripture mentions, and loving our neighbor as ourselves. And I think that, and that was the place. And then I see how Christian education, why it's a model, a part of the model of Christian education, is because it's in that formation of people in the likeness of Jesus Christ, of loving God and loving neighbor. That curriculum then is developed with that emphasis in mind. So as I mentioned earlier, the curriculum that I've developed for our denomination has been with that framework of sense of formation of people. So when we started talking about titles for the book, this initially I was just calling it Christian Education in the African-American Church. And as time went on and as I wrote the book, the more and more I saw the sense of a need to talk about formation. And the authors, the publishers, of course, helped me to use the right words and put it in the right sequence to make it sound and make it hopefully that are appealing to people. But that idea of formation, I want to emphasize, started at Memphis Theological Seminary many years ago.
Mm-hmm. How do you see, if you're going to contrast kind of a different model of Christian education that doesn't emphasize formation with the model that you're advocating for, what makes them different?
I think what makes them different is that oftentimes the emphasis in Christian education, or sometimes in some arenas, is to learn the Bible and what the Bible says, and so people end up knowing a good sense about what the Bible says, but not really getting a grasp of why the Bible is written and how we use it in order to help edify people and move people in the arenas and in the places where Jesus calls us to be. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes people leave classes around curriculum that has been built with the sense of people knowing that's, I want to say, with a lot of sense of knowing, but not a lot of sense of forming people into any particular way or direction. People have a lot of knowledge, but nothing has really changed with them. And as I like to use this, and students in my class have heard me say this, is that this sense of getting the knowledge, but also forming our hearts so that we can do mission and do ministry and the world with our hands and our feet. Oftentimes other Christian education models do not necessarily move us into that formation phase.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things you do at the outset of the book is you give a really nice overview of kind of the context of the African-American church and all of its variety and richness historically. How do you see that history as connected to your emphasis upon formation in Christian education?
Well, I think I begin the book, and most people do, and I don't consider myself a historian by any means, but and certainly not a historian of the African-American church. But my research tells me about the African-American church, that it was born out of oppression and racism. And so this sense of being born out of oppression and racism pushes the African-American church to be concerned with liberation and freedom, and along with salvation and the education, of course, part of it is a part of that helps people move people from a sense of oppression. I mean, not sense, but being oppressed to a sense of freedom and being liberated. And ultimately, people's salvation is tied up with this sense of liberation.
It makes me wonder about this connection. I'd like to hear you talk about what's the connection between Christian education and liberation, or how is education liberating?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. That's a very good question. I think for the African American, specifically, because coming out of the throes of initially the church comes out of a place of being where slavery, American slavery, is the whole set of where people come, and they come and start the church in various ways. The invisible church initially being there, where there's no building, and where people actually find a sense of hope and direction that goes beyond their present situation. So education becomes that place or that piece that helps people to see that oppression, first of all, is not what God seeks for us to have, is not what the people made. And then secondly, and along with that, is that no one's inferior to anyone else. We're all made in the image of God. And education lifts us into that plane of understanding that although I'm oppressed and I have these things that have kept me from being able to free to do things, my liberation from that, my freedom that comes from that, comes out of my education. And the more educated I become, the more freer I become, the freer I become, and more liberated I become, because I see there are no limits to what God has created in anyone, and that those limitations are placed on us by people and not by God.
Mm-hmm. So sometimes in a classroom, it doesn't feel very liberating.
Right. Right.
In fact, it feels quite the opposite. It feels like it's deadening and oppressive.
Right.
But you talk in the book, and you touch upon and develop this notion of a kind of critical pedagogy or liberatory pedagogy. How is that different from a more traditional pedagogy that might not be so liberating?
Okay. I think and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about models of Christian education that depend so much on knowledge and upon pouring into people, that the teacher stands before the classroom as the expert, as the one who gives all of the information to the people. And then the people, the students, they receive this information, and where it becomes oppressive is that students receiving much information, and this information is then asked to be regurgitated to the professor through tests and exams, and that the person is examined on basic whether or not they got what the professor said. And so there is no critical thought process in there. It's strictly about what the professor said. So if I say what the professor says for me to say, I get a good grade. But if I don't say what the professor says, and even though it might be a good thing that I'm saying, it's not what the professor says, so therefore it can't be right. So what happens with that is that with critical pedagogy is the sense of first being able not only to identify a problem or a situation, but to be able to reflect upon that situation and take time to reflect upon that. And then out of that reflection comes action, comes what do I do next? Now that I have received the information, I have, and it becomes transformative because then I am just not knowledge is just not being transferred to me from one person to another, but it becomes transformative, and it allows me then to be able to be transformative in my own life as a result of that, because I have not just been one who has received, but I've also reflected. I've used this mind that God has given me to, and my own experiences, which are valuable in the learning process. And the whole thing, I think what John Wesley is getting at with the quadrilateral is that scripture and tradition and experience and reason all then come into play. And then in this reflection, and then I can take action as a result of that. So for instance, and I use this as an example in church school lessons, which I have a responsibility of producing for my denomination, is that it's always this sense of trying to get the people, hopefully in the local church, to get the biblical message, of course, but to reflect upon it, to have their hearts moved as a result of this message has been given. And then at the end of the class, what action will you take as a result of hearing this message on justice, this message on love? What will you do with it? I mean, will it just become more information that you have and stockpiled in your head? And I think much of education from the public school system, I mean, from our secular school systems all the way through, has done this to people. So I like to say that there are a lot of people who have gotten, I mean, who are considered very intelligent, I mean, only because they got good grades, and they got good grades because they were able to give what the professor told them to give to them, and not with any thinking. So they come out of school not able to think, not able to really reflect.
Yeah, it makes me wonder about the work that you've done. And this isn't really talked directly about in the book, but the revolutionary way in which one has to approach doing online education, where you can't be the sage on the stage.
Right.
You have to be the facilitator. Say a little bit about sort of has your work in terms of developing online courses, is this worked hand in hand with that kind of critical pedagogy, or are there tensions there?
There are tensions. I think the real challenge, well, I'll go back. It works hand in hand, but there are tensions there, because I think the tension comes is because in the online, of course, we're talking about learner outcomes, and we're trying to see what we want to take place at the end of the day. And sometimes when you're doing online, it's a little bit challenging as compared to face-to-face, because as you know, as a professor, sometimes when you're doing face-to-face, based on, as I say, the temperature of the class, you may change the direction that you're going in order to get to those outcomes. But when on the online, because the work is to make sure you give the students all this information up front, there's not a lot of room sometimes for making those kinds of adjustments. And so I've chosen, and so how I have approached online education, and as you know, I started online education in my denomination a long time ago, doing that. And what I learned from that experience is that you have to be able to not necessarily try to prepare everything at one time. You have to sort of gauge. And so lectures, and students who've been in my classes, they sometimes don't get the video until 2 weeks before the class they're going to be that week that they're going to use it, because I'm still trying to gauge what has happened before, reading their reflections and their discussions, and trying to do that, and trying to be critical in that, and trying always to look at exactly what I'm looking for, what we're looking for in the end game at the learning outcome. So there is some tension, but certainly I have learned to teach with a critical pedagogical approach to every class, and both in church and outside of church. That's always the game. Sometimes I think seminary students don't always get it, or students don't always get it, because we're so ingrained with this other kind of transfer of knowledge.
Yeah, and it's tough, because if you're a student and you're coming to a school like Memphis Theological Seminary, you're coming in part because you want to learn from the kind of the experts in the field, and yet what we're hoping to accomplish with the education is to help students develop their own abilities to become experts.
Absolutely.
And that's a real tension, I think, in kind of how much information can be sort of poured into the open head, and before it becomes just overwhelming. Um, it's really the in your book you draw this contrast between education as a product and education as a process. And is that related to this critical pedagogy?
It is very much related to it, and I'm not sure if I talk about it in the book, but part of it I probably do, um, and part of that comes from the sense of being a process, is that it's a lifetime process um, and so it's not, education is not just trying to produce someone who has a degree, uh, but trying to process. And what you said earlier, Dr. Gathje, is that at the end, when a person graduates, they're really seeking to do more after they graduate, because they've not only the knowledge been poured in, but because of that interest has been tweaked so much that the
Mhm.
person is ready to plow into and sometimes move into another level of learning. And I think one of the things that we've done with education in the United States, particularly, I mean, we consumerize everything, and because we do that, sometimes people see getting degrees as some consumer type thing, and not necessarily something that's going to help the rest of the world.
Mhm.
The whole idea of education, as when people ask me, what is education? I say what's the purpose of education is to produce good citizens, and that's really what. And when I say good citizens, I mean people who contribute to the welfare of society.
Mhm. So, with the emphasis on Christian formation, the production of persons who are disciples of Jesus Christ.
Yes,
And
yes,
as you're talking, it makes me think of Christian education as a spiritual discipline.
yes,
So it's something that there's a way of entering into the world, um, as we're seeking to be educated, that connects us in some way with the experience of God.
yes.
How do you see that?
Oh, I see it very much on target with that. And I think when I start talking in the chapter about worship, I think this is part of where I'm trying to lead us. And the whole idea of spiritual formation is the idea of being formed with you, and the spiritual disciplines are part of the things that help move us in that direction.
Mhm.
Prayer and Bible study are integral to the formation of people into the likeness of Jesus Christ. Not just, people, this is where the thing of just saying the teacher stands in front of you and pours out the Sunday school lesson or the Bible lesson. I grew up with a great pastor, but the way he taught Bible study was that you just opened the book, starting in Genesis, and kept going through the rest of and you read it. But there was really nothing that gave you any sense about what's the purpose of all of this.
Mhm.
Of course, you did it because the pastor said that's what you did. Uh, but for me, of teaching people the importance of prayer, the importance of Bible study, and how to do those Bible studies that are effective, all part of this sense of producing or the process of person being formed in the likeness of Jesus Christ.
Mhm. So it's key, of course, that uh, the very word disciple means student.
Yes.
And it seems that Jesus was gathering students around him as a good rabbi would.
Yes.
Um, but I'm wondering about this connection too of how education in opening us up to our own critical thinking, and also to the possibility that things the way things are is not the way things have to be, how that's connected to the reality of God.
Yeah. I think that's connected from the sense of knowing that I guess I like to put it this way, that humans have a tendency not to get it right. And because of our own biases, we tend to go down the wrong path in so many ways. And seeing the reality of God, and this is an important piece of understanding. And there are these great themes when we start talking about Bible. There are these great themes that run throughout the Bible that oftentimes get missed because we're looking more at the idea of the do's and the don'ts and the more realistic type things, and not seeing this larger theme of who God is, and particularly this theme of love that God, throughout the biblical text, we see God's always loving. There's this loving God who's always forgiving and always merciful, always giving grace, and even in the Old Testament. And these are things that sometimes as humans we miss because we get so caught up in moralistic type things that oftentimes we miss the larger issues that are there in front of us. And this Sunday I was just talking about, for example, that many people today would call themselves Christians, Christians, mainly because they stay out of trouble. They don't do these things. They are in the good don't part of it. But when we really look at the scripture, God is pushing us to the do part, not the don't part. But we don't do this, don't do that, don't do that. I know I grew up hearing the don'ts, all of the don'ts that come out, what Christians don't do. But the question is, what do Christians?
It makes me think of the phrase from John Lewis about getting into good trouble.
Yes.
So the rule follower doesn't get into trouble, but doesn't really contribute anything to moving us forward in the good. And think of biblical characters. So many of them are doing good trouble.
Yes, they are. They are, absolutely. Even Jesus himself.
Yeah, pretty good way to describe him, actually.
Yes, right. Yeah.
And thinking about this drives me towards the end of the book. But don't worry, I'm not ending our conversation, but there's this wonderful chapter towards the end of the book in which you talk about the connection between Christian education and the nurturing of hope. And it's not, I'd never really thought of education generally, but Christian education specifically about nurturing hope. So how do you make that connection?
Well, I make it this way. That hope is that thing that allows persons to hold on to something in the spite of the most difficult situations, most difficult struggle that a person might have. And it gives a person a sense of hope even beyond the present situation, and may even be in eternity. And I don't use it in the book, but when you ask that question, the first thing that comes to mind is my father, because my father taught Sunday school all of my life. And he was being formed in the faith through the biblical text, the Sunday school, the lessons that he was teaching, and his research and all of that he was doing. It was forming him. It was his Christian education that was forming him in such a way that he came to in one of our dinners at Thanksgiving, family gathering, where it's around 40 people as normal around in the area. And he pulled together all of his children, his 7 children, and he told us at that table that no longer was he afraid of death. And where he had, and that he had been nurtured in a hope that transcended his present situation on the earth. Now, my father grew up didn't grow up. He was my first 13 or 14 years in life. He was a sharecropper, and so and he never made a lot of money. He always worked for these low paying jobs, but his hope was beyond that present situation, and his hope has transcended so that death was not a concern for him, knowing that that wasn't the end. So at the end of his life, and he told us things, at his funeral, he said, at that table, he said, I've already written my obituary. I've written the funeral program, and and he told each one of us, the 7 of us, what he wanted us to do, told me I was going to do the eulogy. And all of that was there. And I think it all came because he had spent his life in the biblical text, finding hope through the reading and studying, and going past the reading, but the studying of the scripture with the aid of Sunday school books produced by our denomination that had great commentary that helped him to teach it and learn the stories so well that it gave him a hope of the resurrection. Whereas if without that education, he would not have had that hope. And I think that what Christian education does for people, even in normal circumstances, is that it helps people to see, and particularly I say this with African Americans, that you can live beyond today, that there's a resurrection moment, that there's a time when hope will outdo everything else. And then I give a second example, and I should have written these in the book, great examples that I'm thinking of now. But
second version, the second volume.
Yes, yeah. When I tell this story, and I sometimes tell it in class, but our second child, we had a car accident, a terrible car accident, head-on crash. My wife then, who is deceased now, was hit she was pregnant, 3 months pregnant with our second child. And to make a long story short, it was such a horrendous situation that at that time they couldn't do the x-rays, and we really didn't know for 6 months whether or not the child was okay. We really didn't know that. But we went through life in its normal way. After being in the hospital a month for 5 months, each Sunday, we would put, with the help of my sister-in-law or my sister, we would put her in a wheelchair. She would get in a wheelchair, push her to the car, get out of the car, put the wheelchair in the trunk of the car, and pull her up these long steps at the church Sunday after Sunday. And that's because, and her hope, my hope was, and I wasn't preaching then, we were both lay people, but we had both been involved in the church all of our lives. And so we had been nurtured in the faith. And so we believed, and our hope was that everything was going to be all right. So much so that when Hope, our daughter, was born, part of her name is Hope, because that's what we held on to through that whole process. And I say, and that's why I say being nurtured in hope, that Christian education is that our classes that we do and the curriculum that we develop, and I think this happens with African Americans all the time because of the oppression that, as we all know, didn't stop when slavery in this country was abolished. It's the oppression has continued, and because of that oppression, and those who are nurtured in hope are able to move beyond their present situation and look for something greater.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes me think of that line of we have a different world in view.
Yes.
Another world in view.
Another world in view.
Another world in view.
Yeah.
And really, another world in view is what can come from biblical study, from prayer, from worship. One of the things I really love about your book is that you recognize that Christian education is, you not only recognize, but you discuss how Christian education is not limited to the classroom.
Yes.
That it takes place in other aspects of church life. Say a little more about that.
I will. And I like to use the term, as I start with that, is that as John Wesley saw the world as his parish, I see the world as my classroom. And and every place that I am, I think that teaching is taking place in some way or another. And what I say in worship particularly, and where I really say this, Dr. Gathje, is I say this with in church as well as with students, is that I use the example of prayer. What we say in prayer is teaching people about God. Mm-hmm. And so when we start talking about, in my class, my intro class, and I spend time talking about inclusive language. When we talk about God strictly as masculine, then we're telling people that God is a man. And whether we intend to or not, that's what we're teaching people. And then I say the same thing happens in worship with our songs. And I use the example, oftentimes in the African-American church, we sing songs that talk strictly about Jesus and never talk about the Spirit, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So oftentimes we teach people, we teach people there is no triune God. And anything about the triune. So and then the sermon, of course, whatever we're saying in the sermon, we're certainly teaching people something about God, but I don't get so much on it, but I stick mainly with prayers and the songs and the liturgy in general. Mm-hmm. So what I teach people, and I practice this myself with prayer, I learned this at Memphis Theological Seminary doing my MDiv, is that for me, in order to make sure I'm inclusive, I write the prayer, because oftentimes when I speak, I'm not inclusive because the habit of saying what we say. But when you write, you have to think about what you're saying. And when you think about it and you write it, and of course, knowing that you're praying in public, it's not just a prayer between you and God, it's a prayer of the people. And that's sort of the hardest thing sometimes for people in the church to see. People want to say, okay, this is just me and God. No, it's not you and God. You're praying here in the church. So all these people, if you and God, you go in your closet and pray by yourself. But when you're praying here, you're praying for the people.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's when I teach Christian ethics, talk about how there's moral formation, which is related to education, in how we worship, who we worship with, where we worship. I used to say when I was teaching at Christian Brothers University, I'd ask the students, what's your experience of worship? Do you experience God there? And of course, a lot of undergraduates say, no, church is just boring.
Right.
And then I said, well, why do you think it's boring? What makes it so boring? And then they talk about their church, and their church was basically just everybody who was like themselves.
Yes.
And I said, well, maybe the church is boring because Jesus isn't there.
Right.
Because you haven't invited in the folks that Jesus tended to hang around with.
Absolutely.
And that's a kind of thinking about worship as education, as formation, and not just as a place where we go on Sunday and sort of go through the ritual or the sort of usual ways of doing things. Right. One of the ways you talk about worship you have a chapter in your book about testimony. And of course, the testimony, I grew up Roman Catholic. I'm still Roman Catholic. We don't have testimony in our worship. So what is testimony? How does that work? And how is it part of education?
Well, I think testimony, I did grow up with testimony in church, but I don't see it so much now in my own experience with and seeing testimony. We have testimonies once a year, watch nights before the new year comes in. But of course, there are many African-American churches that do testimony. And I think it's part of the ethos of being African-American is that what testimony becomes education for us is that it forms us and teaches us as Christian disciples how doors that in life that are fulfilling our calling, and that God gives us the gifts the spiritual gifts to fulfill that calling. That I use that, and I think in the book I give the example of my son Chris, because I think how we see God moving in ways that oftentimes we don't necessarily ourselves see it. I use myself as an example. That I don't think I do it in the book because I don't like to do too much of that. But my own journey from being in the world as an accountant, leaving college, being an accountant, with the idea that I was going to make a lot of money as an entrepreneur and all these kinds of things, but that God's calling changed the whole direction and the whole path of my life and trajectory of my life. And that trajectory, I have seen how God has, the spiritual gifts God has given me in order to fulfill fulfill that calling. And I think this is how we see testimony as God fulfilling God's call and purpose in people's lives. And I think that this is that God was in the picture all of the time, and that God was working things through us that we didn't see. And even I think I mentioned that sometimes doors get closed and it looks like it's not going to happen, but then the door opens. And that door opening is God using God's ways of opening doors to help us fulfill the calling that God has on our life. And our part in that, our participation is in that, is our willingness to do so. God calls us, but God doesn't make us do it. We have to be participants in it, and that participants in using and realizing what God has given us and through spiritual gifts, and developing those spiritual gifts, and knowing that because we have a gift doesn't mean that that's the end of it. We have to do something to help develop it. When people say they call to preach, for instance, that doesn't mean that you're fully equipped to do this. You just been called to do it.
Yeah, I think that part of the power of testimony is the power of storytelling.
Yes.
And how storytelling is educational. I mean, we learn about a community by the stories that it tells.
Yes.
And think about how formative that stories are in our communities, in our families, that there are certain stories that get retold every time the family gets together. And it seems to me that's a kind of testimony that people stand up to testify. They're sharing their story in a way that's meant to edify the other people who are there for the worship.
Absolutely. You said it perfectly. Exactly. That's what the testimony does. And it edifies. And I think I say this in the book, that it edifies and builds up the people. And that's what part of what education is about, is in a large part is building people up, not for their own sake, but to be contributors to the larger society. And I emphasize this a lot, that all of our education is in some way is there for us to be able to use it for the building up of other people. And oftentimes we get, in my case, your case, we get paid to do that, but that does not negate the fact that the calling to do that is so important to us. And the reason that we're educated is to do that, not to just sit back and say we have it, but to actually do something with it.
Yeah, that leads me to a somewhat personal question of how did you discern that your vocation was to be an educator?
Okay,
That's where you started.
Okay, that's a very good, and I'm going to do this. It started. It's interesting that I said the story earlier. Said this about my father was Sunday school teacher, and when I was 14, 15 years old, maybe that age, they would give me the book and tell me to teach the lesson, and I had to study it. My father made me do all these things to do that. And so sort of doing that sort of became a part of my life early on, as far as getting in front of people and trying to teach and learning to teach. But how it really became a part of, and I really, Dr. Gathje, I used to tell my wife, my deceased wife, as people know I'm remarried now, but my deceased wife, that she was an educator. I used to tell her that if I knew I was going to marry an educator, I would have probably gone the track of being an educator in the public school. But because we could have taken vacation at the same time. That's what. but what I found is that after I finished school, I mean, I always had this knack for teaching in the church. Even, I mean, when I went through a young adult, I mean, it's always, people are always calling on me to do this teaching. And so then when I came to MTS and did my MDiv, I was inspired by MTS to be a teacher. So I said, when I left MTS, I applied for PhD and I didn't get accepted first. So I said, oh, it's God saying, okay, you're supposed to be a pastor, so stay a pastor. And then as time moved on, that opportunity to do the PhD and then to do what I really wanted to do is to educate. I can tell the story that certainly it's been there all the time. It's just that I've sort of had to go. But what I really found and the real answer to this, how I knew for sure that education was where I was to be, was that the opportunities that that I have been given in the church to teach, and I have thoroughly enjoyed teaching in the church much more than anything else I've done. So that I knew that was the direction I wanted to go in, and I always wanted to continue to do that teaching.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder how that might be connected to what you're really talking about in your book, is that the church setting is unapologetically committed to formation in education.
Absolutely.
Which is not the model of education that is in the university setting or typical, just a typical grade school or high school. It's more the imparting of knowledge without really much concern about one's character.
Right. Exactly. And that is what, and what concerns me, and that's where the book is so important to me, is that what has concerned me is that I think that oftentimes the church's education gets so influenced by that other education that it too becomes just about transferring knowledge.
Well, it's certainly a danger that seminaries have faced.
Yes.
Especially seminaries as they've become more tied to university settings, yes. More answerable to the university context and the kind of the professional guild of university teaching. There's certainly been a push away at various points from education as formation. This makes me think about the last chapter in which you asked the question that Dr. King asked of where do we go from here? What do you think Christian education has to do in order to make sure it stays focused on formation and on the development of Christian disciples?
I think that that what Christian education has to do is, first of all, as one of the texts that I've used, Roker Partham says, moving Christian education to center stage, and I think this is the central thing that I would want to say, is that it cannot be something that we do on a secondary, just an optional thing. As you know, that many seminaries today, for instance, many seminaries today don't have Christian education or educational ministry as a part of their core courses. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a terrible mistake, because what it's saying to the church is that educational ministry is not the core part of the education needed by a pastor for a church. Mm-hmm. So that's number one, and it needs to move to center stage. It needs to also be a sense of, has been alluded to and said earlier, involved in critical pedagogy, and not just the transfer of knowledge.
Mhm.
And by moving to center stage means that, and this for me in the African-American context, is to make sure that our budgets reflect that it's center stage, that it's more important, not just as important, but more important than a lot of other things that we pour money into, and to see Christian education as not just for children, youth, young adults, but it's for the entire church, and that it's for a lifetime. It's for the lifetime process. And so that means the investment into the things that are necessary to make Christian education be in the center stage, not only move there, but to stay there and to be what is the most important part of what the church is doing. Because the ultimate concern would be, and I think I probably say this, is that making disciples, and that followers of Jesus Christ, students and followers of Jesus Christ. And that's, if the church is to be the church, and if the church is to move past where it is now, it must be involved in making disciples and following that great commission, going everywhere and doing just that.
Thank you. That's, I think it's helpful to think about how bad theology, which comes out of a bad education,
Yes.
has really serious consequences
Right.
in our churches, in our personal lives, in the broader society, and certainly see plenty of bad theology around in these days. I want to turn to a couple of questions from folks who have been listening in tonight. And one of them has to do with online education in relationship to the African-American Church. Does the format of online education serve the African-American churches well? Or do you see it as ineffective as a form of education?
And of course, it always depends on what you're teaching. I really believe it does serve the church well when done properly, and when people are prepared to do so. As a matter of fact, as I noted earlier, several years ago, and this is prior to MTS, I did this with Christian educators, and my experience with them was overwhelmingly, it was very effective, because and that was my first experience in doing that. But what it all comes down to is the teacher. It really does, because if you're invested in it and invest yourself, if the teacher invests him or herself into that teaching, it can serve the church very well. I do a Bible study each week, and every week there are people from across the country who take part of that through just doing this Zoom thing. I mean, it's and a few months ago I would have never thought about doing that, but I find that that's an opportunity for people, and I think it serves whatever church, any group of people, and I think that it's just another opportunity. Now, for me to say this, that's the only way to do it, no, that's not the only way by any means. I always prefer face-to-face, but when we're in situations as we are now, we have to do, not only just do it because we have to do it, we have to do it better than anybody else does it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a helpful point, that we can sort of begrudgingly enter into this venue for education, or we can enter into it with the kind of passion and creativity that we would bring into our regular classroom. Another question is, what kind of frustration do you find in trying to teach formation?
Oh, well, yeah. Let me give you an example of frustration. And this is the example of in 2006, I was 4 years into being General Secretary of Christian Education, but I had been educated at Memphis Theological Seminary, and formation was certainly a part of. So I tried to change the name of our department from Christian Education and add formation to it. That didn't work. It took 12 years. In 2018, now we have that name. But I never stopped teaching it. I never stopped using the word. And now people use it but it's not so much frustration. It's just, one of our bishops told me a long time ago, in about 2006, 2007, he said, sometimes a person can just be ahead of where the church is. And you got to have the patience to keep on doing what you know is good for the church. So, and for the people. And so I don't really call it so much frustration. It's just that you have to have patience.
Mm-hmm. It's good advice. Yeah. And I think it's revolutionary, I think, to maybe not revolutionary, but it's countercultural to think of education as formation,
yes,
rather than education as simply the imparting of knowledge. And part of that is a sort of false sense of objectivity of that. We're not going to be personally engaged with what we're teaching or with what we're learning. So I have one final question. How do you help older members set in their ways to open up their mind to new theological ideas in Christian education and formation?
I haven't really, only one quick answer to that, and it's my answer to everything: teach. I tell people this all the time in the church, that I am convinced that the solution to all of the church's problems is teaching, and patience, and perseverance, and recognizing that not everyone will come along. And when I finally learned one thing about what Jesus said, that if anyone chooses to be my disciple, when I finally learned that everybody's not going to choose to do it, but it's not my job to make them choose it, but it's my job to teach it. And my job is to teach, and that people who choose to follow will follow. And that's not trying, be harsh in any way. It's just being realistic.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Crutchfield. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here this evening. I'm going to hold the book up so everybody can see. The Formation of a People, Christian Education in an African-American Context. Judson Press, available in all sorts of booksellers. We'll be happy to have you order this book. And I certainly have Christian education is not my field of specialty, but I've been a professor for a long time now, and I really found this to be a delightful read and really helpful in the kind of survey and analysis of different approaches to Christian education, and to think of Christian education in this broader sense of not simply the imparting of knowledge, but of formation in a way of life. So I thank you, Dr. Crutchfield, for this fine book, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much for having me and for arranging for this discussion. And thank you to all of those who are part of tonight. Thank you. I see many students and staff people of MTS, and I'm grateful for your presence.
Great, thank you. And one little plug announcement at the end. We're on Tuesday, December 8th at the same time, 7 o'clock. My next guest will be Dr. Andre Johnson, who will be talking about his brand new book on Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. So don't miss that. Our friend Nathan Brassfield will be sending out some promotional material about that. And that's the next time we'll gather for a good book discussion. So thank you, everybody. Thank you again, Dr. Crutchfield. Thank you, Nathan. And good night to everybody.
Good night to all.